My name is Florence. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, dependable. The one who shows up early, stays late, remembers birthdays, smooths over tension, and never raises her voice. I work a professional job. I keep my life orderly, and from the outside, nothing about me looks dramatic or fractured. That's probably why no one ever thought to warn me. People tend to underestimate me, not in a cruel way, but in a quiet, almost invisible way. They assume I'm resilient because I don't complain, that I'm simple because I'm calm, that I accept things because I don't argue. For years, I let that perception stand, partly because it felt easier, and partly because I genuinely believed that loyalty and patience would eventually be returned in the same measure. This story isn't about a sudden betrayal or a single explosive moment. It's about something much slower and more unsettling. It's about realizing, piece by piece, that the version of reality I was living inside wasn't shared by the people closest to me. It's about the moment I finally had to admit to myself. I realized my family had been lying to me my entire life. Not with one grand lie, but with a pattern of omissions, distortions, and quiet agreements made without me. For a long time, I believed that if something important were happening around me, I would be told. If decisions affected my life, my voice would be included. I believed love automatically came with honesty. What I didn't understand, until much later, was that there are families where information is power, and silence is a tool. And in those families, there is often one person who is kept calm, useful, and uninformed. Everyone knew except me. What you're about to hear isn't a story of revenge. There are no shouting matches, no dramatic ultimatums, no scenes designed to shock. This is a documentary-style account of awareness, restraint, and psychological reversal. Of what happens when someone stops reacting and starts observing. When silence stops being a weakness and becomes a decision. I'm telling this story honestly, not to punish anyone, and not to paint myself as a victim or a hero. I'm telling it because emotional truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. Sometimes it arrives too late to fix things, but just in time to change who you become next. If you've ever had the feeling that something in your life didn't quite add up, that conversations ended just before the important parts, or that everyone else seemed to have a shared understanding you were never given, then you might recognize yourself somewhere in this story. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever looked back at your own life and wondered what everyone else seemed to know before you did? For most of my life, I occupied a very specific space in my family, one that didn't come with a title, but came with expectations all the same. I was the reasonable one, the adaptable one, the person who could be counted on not to overreact, not to demand too much, not to complicate things. When family members described me to others, they used words like easygoing and mature. I wore those labels without questioning them, because they sounded like compliments. I thought they meant I was trusted. I didn't realize, at the time, that they also meant I was predictable. I was the one who listened while others talked, the one who adjusted plans quietly when schedules changed without consulting me. If there was tension in the room, people often looked at me with relief, because they knew I wouldn't add to it. I would nod, soften my tone, and change the subject if needed. I learned early that being low friction made life smoother for everyone else. No one ever said, "Florence doesn't need to know." But decisions were made around me with remarkable consistency. Plans were discussed before I arrived. Conversations that paused when I entered the room, then resumed with a vague summary afterward. I told myself this was normal. Families were messy. Not everything needed my input. That's what I believed. I wasn't ignored in an obvious way. I was included just enough to feel involved, invited to gatherings, asked for help, trusted with responsibilities. I was the person who organized things, remembered details, and followed through. And because I did all of that well, No one questioned whether I needed transparency in return. If something went wrong, I was expected to understand. If something went right, it was simply how things were supposed to be. Looking back, I can see how carefully that role was shaped. I didn't demand explanations, so none were offered. I didn't challenge inconsistencies, so they were allowed to exist. I didn't ask why certain things felt off because I assumed the problem was my perception, not the situation. In family conversations, I often noticed that others spoke with a shared shorthand. References, glances, unfinished sentences that seemed to make sense to everyone but me. I would smile politely and fill in the gaps with assumptions. I thought I was being considerate. I thought I was respecting boundaries. What I didn't understand was that those gaps weren't accidental. I was useful because I was calm. I was safe because I didn't press. I was convinced because I trusted. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't come from being overlooked, but from being relied upon too heavily in the wrong way. I wasn't dismissed. I was managed. My emotions were anticipated and quietly accounted for, like variables that needed to be kept stable. I absorbed disappointment without naming it. I explained away discomfort before it reached the surface. If something didn't sit right, I told myself I was being sensitive, or tired, or imagining patterns that weren't there. And the truth is, I didn't feel unhappy. That's what made it so difficult to recognize. My life functioned. My relationships were polite, even warm on the surface. There were no dramatic conflicts to point to. Nothing I could clearly label as wrong. But there was a persistent sense of being slightly out of step, like joining a conversation midway through, always catching up, never quite present at the beginning. I was included after the fact, informed once things were settled, trusted with outcomes, but not origins. At the time, I believed this was simply my place, that families naturally assign roles, and mine was to steady the ground beneath everyone else's feet. I told myself it was honorable. I told myself it was love. What I didn't yet see was that this role came with a cost. That being the person who handles things often means being the person who isn't told the whole truth. And that invisibility doesn't always feel like exclusion. Sometimes it feels like responsibility. I didn't feel wronged. I felt needed. And for a long time, that was enough. Until it wasn't. The first moment that stands out now didn't feel important at the time. That's the strange part. There was no argument, no raised voice, no visible shift in anyone's behavior. It was just a detail, a small one, that didn't quite align with what I had been told. It happened around something ordinary, a family plan, a decision that affected all of us in small ways, and me in a slightly larger one. I remember being informed, casually, as though the conversation had already happened, and I was just being brought up to speed. The tone was light, almost apologetic, but not quite. "We didn't think you'd mind," someone said. And because I didn't want to seem difficult, or worse, emotional, I nodded. I said it was fine. I said it made sense. I meant it too. Or at least I thought I did. Later that evening, alone, I replayed the exchange in my mind. Not obsessively. Just enough to notice that the explanation had been thin, that certain details missing, that the decision had clearly required discussion, coordination, and agreement. Things that don't happen spontaneously. I felt a flicker of confusion, quickly smoothed over by logic. They probably didn't want to bother me. It wasn't a big deal. I would have agreed anyway. Those thoughts arrived quickly, well-practiced, like reflexes I had learned years earlier. The discomfort passed, or rather, it was filed away. What I didn't realize then was that this was the first small cut. Not painful enough to draw attention, but precise enough to leave a mark. It wasn't about the decision itself. It was about the assumption beneath it. The quiet certainty that my involvement was optional. I noticed that when I later mentioned something related, the room shifted slightly. Not defensively. More like a recalibration. Someone clarified a point a little too quickly. Someone else changed the subject. It was subtle, but unmistakable once you know what you're looking for. Everyone else seemed at ease. I was the only one holding a loose thread. I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't yet have language for what I was feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal. It was something closer to disorientation. Like stepping onto a stair that wasn't there. That night, I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. Not an accusation, just an observation. I didn't know why I did it. I've always written things down when they don't make sense yet. It's how I buy myself time. In the days that followed, nothing changed. Or rather, everything stayed comfortably the same. And that, in hindsight, was part of the problem. Because the absence of fallout taught me a quiet lesson. That moments like this could pass without consequence. That my silence would be absorbed without question. I told myself not to read into it. That families don't always loop everyone in. That harmony matters more than process. I believed that being flexible was a virtue. But once you notice the first small cut, you begin to recognize the sensation when it happens again. A slight tightening in the chest. A pause before responding. The sense that you've arrived just after the door closed. At the time, I still believed this was a coincidence. I still believed there was nothing intentional behind it. And perhaps, individually, there wasn't. But patterns don't require intention to exist. The truth is, that moment didn't hurt because of what was done. It hurt because of what it suggested. That there were conversations happening without me. And that everyone involved assumed I would understand why. And I did understand. Too quickly, too generously. That was the first time I felt the shape of something forming. A realization I wasn't ready to name. I closed my notebook and went on with my life, convinced that awareness, once noted, could be ignored. I didn't yet know how difficult that would become. Once the first moment had passed, it became easier for the next ones to slip by unnoticed. Not because they were smaller, but because they felt familiar. I had already rehearsed my response. I had already learned how to smooth the edges of discomfort before it reached anyone else. The pattern was never dramatic. It showed up in timing. In the way information reached me after decisions were already finalized. In the gentle phrasing that framed outcomes as inevitable rather than chosen. This is just how it worked out. It made the most sense. We assumed you'd be okay with it, and I usually was. Or at least I appeared to be. Each time I told myself a slightly different version of the same story. That I was being trusted not to make a fuss. That my flexibility was appreciated. That my role was to keep things stable, not to complicate them with unnecessary questions. I began to notice how quickly I rationalized away my own reactions. If something stung, I reminded myself of everyone else's stress. If I felt excluded, I reframed it as efficiency. I prided myself on being emotionally intelligent, on understanding context, reading between the lines, choosing compassion over ego. What I didn't recognize was that I was also teaching people how to treat me. In group conversations, I would wait for a natural pause to speak, one that rarely came. When I did add something, it was often acknowledged with a nod and then gently redirected. Not dismissed outright, just absorbed and moved past. I learned to keep my contributions concise, helpful, and unobtrusive. There was a strange reward system at play. The more agreeable I was, the more I was praised for being easy. The more I adapted, the more my adaptability was expected. No one ever said I was unimportant. They just behaved as though my perspective was optional. I normalized this by telling myself that not every voice needs to be central. That leadership sometimes looks like support. That influence doesn't require visibility. These ideas weren't wrong, but they became a convenient shield against a growing unease. I remember one particular moment when I realized I was the only one adjusting. Plans changed again. Details shifted. I rearranged my schedule quietly, without comment, and as I did, I noticed no one else even considered doing the same. That should have felt unfair. Instead, it felt familiar. I had become so practiced at minimizing my own inconvenience that it barely registered as a sacrifice. I didn't announce it. I didn't keep score. I didn't expect recognition. I told myself that this was maturity, that this was love in action. But beneath that narrative was something harder to admit. I had started to believe that my needs were less legitimate than everyone else's, that my discomfort was something to be managed privately, that if I felt hurt, it was because I hadn't adjusted quickly enough. The notebook filled slowly, not with complaints, but with timestamps, phrases, decisions I wasn't part of. I still wasn't framing them as wrong. I was collecting data without knowing why. When I tried to gently assert myself, nothing confrontational, just a question or a clarification, the response was always smooth, reassuring, slightly amused sometimes, as if I were overthinking something obvious. Don't worry about it. It's already handled. You know how these things are. I nodded. I smiled. I let it go. Over time, I stopped expecting to be consulted. I began to assume that if something truly mattered, someone would tell me. That assumption became a quiet contract I didn't realize I had signed alone. The most unsettling part was that I still felt close to my family. We talked regularly. We shared meals, stories, and memories. On the surface, nothing was broken, which made it even harder to trust the growing sense that something fundamental was misaligned. Disrespect, when it's loud, demands a response. But when it's subtle, consistent, and wrapped in politeness, it becomes easy to mistake for normalcy, especially if you've spent years being praised for your ability to absorb it. By the time I realized how much I was tolerating, it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like who I was. And that's the most dangerous part of normalization. Not that it hurts you once, but that it convinces you that you were built to carry it. There came a moment, not a dramatic one, but a clarifying one, when I finally understood that what I was experiencing wasn't random. It was structured, quietly, efficiently, and over time. I wasn't just being overlooked. I had been assigned a role. Every family has an internal architecture, even if no one ever names it. There are decision makers, enforcers, mediators, and spectators. For years, I believed I floated between categories. In truth, I had been placed somewhere very specific, reliable, useful, and invisible. I was the person who could be counted on to respond rationally, the one who wouldn't escalate, the one who would handle it. And because I did handle things, without complaint, without delay, my role solidified. I began to notice how information traveled. Some people were looped in early. Their opinions shaped outcomes. Others were informed later, with a tone that suggested the matter was settled. I belonged firmly in the second group. It wasn't malicious. That's important to say. No one sat down and decided to exclude me. It was more efficient than that. My reactions were predictable. My compliance was assumed. Over time, those assumptions hardened into certainty. When I did express a preference, it was often reframed as a suggestion rather than a position. "That's a good thought," someone would say, before continuing in the same direction they were already headed. I learned the difference between being heard and being accommodated. And still, I stayed calm. Still, I told myself that my steadiness was valuable. Not needing control was a strength. I didn't want to be someone who demanded space or authority. I wanted to be someone who earned trust through consistency. What I hadn't realized was that trust, in this context, meant predictability, not respect. The moment of clarity came during a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Not secretive, exactly. Just unguarded. I was in the next room, close enough to catch the rhythm of voices, far enough to be forgotten. Someone said my name, followed by a sentence that stopped me cold. It wasn't unkind. It was practical. "She'll understand." That was it. No explanation, no justification, just a conclusion. In that instant, I saw the full outline of the role I had been playing. I was the one whose understanding could be assumed in advance. The one whose emotional response had already been calculated and approved. Understanding, in this context, didn't mean agreement. It meant absorption. It meant taking in whatever was decided and making it work without friction. I didn't confront anyone afterward. I didn't need to. The realization did its work quietly. It reframed years of interactions in a single stroke. Moments that had felt confusing suddenly made sense. Not because they were fair, but because they were consistent. I had been cast as the stabilizer, the buffer, the person whose job was to smooth transitions, not influence direction. And because I was good at it, no one questioned whether I wanted something else. There was grief in that understanding. Not explosive grief, just a deep, steady sadness. I had mistaken my usefulness for inclusion. I had equated being needed with being valued. That night, I wrote more than usual. Not emotionally, precisely. I listed roles, patterns, language. I didn't assign blame. I assigned a structure. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. I still showed up. I still participated. But something had shifted internally. I stopped filling in gaps automatically. I stopped assuming the best without evidence. I didn't announce the change. I simply observed. Because when you realize you've been assigned a role you never agreed to, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to reject it loudly. It's to understand it completely. The shift didn't happen during an argument or after a revelation. It happened on a day so ordinary that I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't already been paying closer attention. I was sitting alone, reviewing something mundane. Documents, dates, obligations that had accumulated quietly over time. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just organizing, the way I always did. That's when I noticed how many of the decisions affecting my life had been made in conversations I hadn't been part of. It wasn't one document. It was the accumulation, the alignment, the realization that these weren't isolated oversights. They were coordinated outcomes, not conspiratorial, just consistent. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain it away. I didn't tell myself that everyone was busy. I didn't assume good intentions would fill in the missing context. I let the discomfort sit without resolving it immediately. And in that pause, something subtle but irreversible happened. I stopped taking it personally. That might sound counterintuitive, but it changed everything. Once I understood that this wasn't about my worth or likability, I could see it clearly for what it was. A system that functioned smoothly because I didn't interfere with it. And systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to behavior. That day, I realized that nothing was going to change unless I changed how I participated. Not by confronting anyone, not by demanding transparency, but by withdrawing the one thing that made the system so efficient: my automatic compliance. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't even fully articulate it yet. It was more like an internal recalibration, a quiet adjustment of posture. I began to notice how often I filled the silence to ease others' discomfort. How quickly I offered solutions when no one had asked for them. How reflexively I accepted explanations that didn't actually explain anything. And I began gently to stop. The first change was almost invisible. I paused before responding. I asked clarifying questions, not accusatory ones, just precise ones. I let answers stand even when they were incomplete. I watched how people reacted when I didn't smooth things over, when I didn't immediately reassure them, when I allowed awkwardness to exist without resolving it. Nothing exploded, but something shifted. People began to repeat themselves, to over-explain, to check my expression before continuing. It was subtle, but it told me something important. My silence had been doing a lot of work before. That day, I understood that I didn't need to be louder to regain agency. I needed to be more deliberate, less available, less predictable. There was no anger in this realization, just clarity. And with clarity came a strange sense of calm. I wasn't plotting anything. I wasn't trying to outmaneuver anyone. I was simply stepping out of a role that no longer fit. I went back to my notebook and wrote one sentence, carefully chosen. Silence can be a response, not a surrender. That was the day something shifted. Not externally, internally. The day I stopped confusing peace with passivity. The day I recognized that my quiet nature wasn't a liability, it was a lever. I didn't know yet how I would use it. I only knew that I finally seen the shape of my own power. And once you see that, you don't rush. After that day, my silence changed in quality. It was no longer the absence of a response. It was a deliberate presence. I spoke when I meant something. I paused when I didn't. And I stopped filling space simply to keep others comfortable. At first, no one noticed. Or rather, they noticed without understanding. My quiet had always been there. They just assumed it meant the same thing it always had. Compliance, agreement, emotional availability. But this silence was different. It wasn't soft. It wasn't apologetic. It didn't rush to reassure. When plans were discussed and I wasn't consulted, I didn't react. I didn't compensate. I noted it. When information arrived late, I didn't smooth it over with understanding. I asked when it had been decided, not why. When? That single shift from justification to timing changed the entire dynamic. People began to answer carefully. Some became slightly defensive, though I hadn't accused them of anything. Others laughed it off. "You know how it is," they said. And for the first time, I let that sentence hang in the air without nodding along. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I was withdrawing the assumption. I no longer assumed good faith where there was no evidence of it. I no longer assumed inclusion where there was only access to outcomes. And still, I remained calm. That calm unsettled people more than any confrontation would have. Because confrontation invites resolution. Silence invites reflection. I noticed how often others mistook my restraint for weakness. How confidently they continued as before, assuming I would adapt in the background. They didn't realize that adaptation had been my contribution, and that I was quietly reclaiming it. Behind the scenes, I began to reorganize my own life. Not dramatically, just deliberately. I reviewed commitments. I documented patterns. I stopped offering free emotional labor. And most importantly, I stopped explaining myself. When I declined something, I didn't justify it. When I needed time, I took it. When I didn't have enough information, I said so, and waited. There's a moment in any shift like this when the people around you feel the imbalance but can't yet name it. They sense something has changed, but they assume it's temporary. A mood. A phase. They wait for you to return to form. I didn't. Instead, I observed how quickly the system began to strain without my quiet support. Small inefficiencies appeared. Miscommunications surfaced. Nothing catastrophic, but noticeable enough to register. And still, no one connected it to me. They had never seen me as a point of leverage. I had been a constant like background music, useful but not consciously acknowledged. That invisibility, once painful, became strategic. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I wasn't withholding punishment. I was simply no longer cushioning outcomes that excluded me. I allowed natural consequences to exist. Silence, when chosen, is not empty. It's full of information. It tells people what you will no longer carry for them. And the most remarkable part? The quieter I became, the more closely people listened. Because when someone who has always absorbed suddenly stops, the absence echoes louder than any protest. While everything on the surface appeared unchanged, something entirely different was happening beneath it. And this was the part no one noticed, because it didn't look like action. It looked like patience. I began preparing without announcing that I was preparing. Not in a dramatic sense. There were no secret meetings, no whispered phone calls. What I did instead was return to a skill I had always possessed but rarely used for myself. Careful attention. I listened differently now. Not to reassure, not to empathize, but to understand structure. I noticed who spoke first in conversations and who followed, who summarized decisions and who benefited from them. Which stories were repeated consistently, and which details quietly shifted depending on the audience. I stopped reacting emotionally to inconsistencies and started cataloging them. The notebook became something else entirely. No longer a place to release confusion, it became a record. Dates, phrasing, sequence. I wrote down what I was told and when. I wrote down what I later learned had already been decided. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I just documented. What surprised me was how easy this became once I stopped needing the situation to be fair. Fairness clouds observation. Detachment sharpens it. I also began learning, intentionally, quietly, about things I had previously trusted others to handle. Finances, legal frameworks, long-term implications of decisions that were often framed as temporary or not worth worrying about. I didn't announce these efforts. I didn't ask permission. I simply educated myself. And as I did, I started to see how much of my exclusion had been justified by assumed incompetence. Not overtly stated, of course, just implied. The unspoken belief that I didn't need to understand the full picture because I wouldn't want to, or wouldn't handle it well. That assumption dissolved quickly. I realized that my calm had been mistaken for passivity, my restraint for disinterest, my trust in ignorance. And once I removed those misinterpretations, the entire narrative shifted. What they never noticed was that I had stopped needing them to explain things to me. I began asking different questions. Not many. Just precise ones. Questions that required clear answers, not platitudes. And when those answers didn't come, I didn't push. I waited. I cross-referenced. I also noticed how often people revealed the truth when they assumed I wasn't tracking it. How relaxed they became in my presence, believing I was still the same Florence, understanding, accommodating, safely non-threatening. That familiarity worked in my favor. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't deceiving. I was simply no longer volunteering to carry what wasn't mine. In the background, I adjusted my own positioning. I separated responsibilities, clarified boundaries, sometimes aloud, sometimes through action. I ensured that what I contributed was visible, traceable, and no longer absorbent of others' oversights. There's a particular power in being underestimated while fully aware that you are. It gives you time to see the full map, time to understand where pressure points exist, not to exploit them, but to recognize them. Time to choose your next move without urgency or fear. By the time anyone sensed that something had changed, I was already standing on firmer ground. Not emotionally hardened, just structurally informed. And still, no one suspected preparation. Because preparation doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like someone who has finally stopped explaining themselves. And sometimes it looks exactly like the person everyone thought they already understood. The reveal didn't arrive with adrenaline. There was no rush, no triumph. Just a quiet moment of alignment, when all the pieces I had been observing settled into a single, unmistakable truth. I remember exactly where I was when it happened, sitting alone, reviewing information I had gathered over months. Notes, documents, timelines. Nothing dramatic on its own. But together, they told a story that could no longer be interpreted generously. It became clear that I hadn't just been excluded from conversations. I had been managed. Information had been filtered deliberately, not to protect me, but to maintain a certain balance of control. Decisions that directly affected my future had been made with the assumption that I would adapt, absorb, and move on. And everyone knew, not in the sense that there was a meeting or an agreement, but in the way people know when a system benefits them. In the way silence can function as consent when no one challenges it. Everyone knew except me. Seeing that sentence written in my notebook stopped me. Not because it shocked me, but because it explained everything. The confusion, the delayed disclosures, the careful phrasing, the confidence with which outcomes were presented as fates accompli. What I discovered wasn't a secret in the conventional sense. It was a pattern of behavior that only remained invisible as long as I believed I was included. The leverage wasn't a single piece of information. It was understanding. Understanding how much my cooperation had stabilized outcomes for others. How many plans relied on my predictability. How many assumptions would collapse if I simply stopped participating the way I always had. That clarity didn't make me angry. It made me still. I didn't feel the urge to confront anyone immediately. There was nothing to gain from that. The truth didn't need defending. It just needed to be acted on carefully. I sat with the realization for a long time. Long enough for the emotional charge to dissipate. Long enough to separate impulse from intention. This was the moment when I understood that I had options. Real ones. Not reactive choices, but strategic paths. Each with consequences I could now anticipate. And for the first time, those consequences weren't abstract. I closed the notebook and didn't write anything else that day. There was nothing left to document. I had reached the end of observation. What followed would require a decision, not a loud decision, not a dramatic decision, just a clear, irreversible shift in how I moved through the world. The reveal didn't give me power. It showed me that I had always had it. I just hadn't known where it was stored. And once you locate something like that, you don't rush to use it. You choose. After the truth fully settled into place, I did something that would have seemed strange to anyone watching from the outside. I did nothing. Not because I was frozen. Not because I was overwhelmed. But because I finally understood the value of a pause. For most of my life, I had been responsive. Quick to adapt. Quick to soothe. Quick to decide in ways that reduced friction for everyone else. That reflex had been mistaken for generosity, for strength, even for wisdom. In reality, it had often been a way of staying safe, of keeping relationships intact by absorbing uncertainty myself. This time I refused to rush. I let the realization breathe. I let it move through me without trying to soften it, justify it, or reframe it into something more comfortable. I allowed myself to sit with the full weight of what I now understood. That the people closest to me had organized their lives, their decisions, and their expectations around the assumption that I would quietly comply. Not maliciously, not with cruelty, but with certainty. That certainty was what changed everything. I began to think in terms I never had before. Not emotionally, but structurally. I stopped asking, how do I feel about this? And started asking, what does this require of me if I continue? Who benefits from my silence? What collapses if I withdraw it? These were not questions I had been taught to ask. They felt almost unnatural at first. But once they appeared, they demanded answers. I saw 3 paths clearly. The first was confrontation. I could sit everyone down, lay out what I had observed, present the timelines, the patterns, the quiet decisions made without me. I imagined their faces, surprised, defensive, confused. I imagined the reassurances. That wasn't our intention. You're reading too much into it. We didn't think you'd mind. I had no doubt that some version of remorse would follow, perhaps even promises to do better. But I also knew something else. Confrontation would recenter the system around emotion, around explanations, around damage control. It would invite everyone to adjust just enough to keep things functional, without fundamentally changing how power moved. And I would once again be cast as the reasonable one. The one who listened. The one who accepted partial accountability to keep the peace. I had played that role too well to believe it would end differently this time. The second path was endurance. I could stay. Continue participating, now fully aware. I could accept the limitations of my role and treat them as a trade-off for connection. Many people do this. They decide that harmony is worth asymmetry, that love doesn't require fairness, only continuity. For a moment, I considered it seriously, but awareness changes the cost of endurance. What once felt like patience now felt like consent. What once felt like understanding now felt like self-erasure. I knew that if I stayed without changing anything, I would become complicit in my own marginalization. And that kind of quiet betrayal leaves a residue. It turns calm into numbness, loyalty into resentment. I wasn't willing to pay that price anymore. The third path was the one that required the most discipline and the least explanation. Withdrawal. Not abandonment, not estrangement, not emotional withdrawal. Structural withdrawal. It meant removing myself from dynamics that relied on my predictability. It meant stepping out of roles I had never formally agreed to, but had been quietly assigned. It meant allowing consequences to surface without intercepting them. This option didn't come with the satisfaction of being understood. In fact, it guaranteed misunderstanding. For a while. People would assume I was tired, or distant, or going through a phase. They would fill the gap with their own interpretations because I wasn't offering one. And that was the point. I chose the third path not because it was easier, but because it was honest. Once that decision crystallized, something inside me settled. Not emotionally, structurally, like a building whose foundation had finally been reinforced. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't anticipating reactions. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I knew what I would do, and just as importantly, what I would no longer do. I would no longer agree to plans I hadn't been part of shaping. I would no longer absorb inconvenience framed as inevitability. I would no longer translate vague assurances into obligations for myself. And I would do all of this without announcement, because announcements invite negotiation. And I was done negotiating my right to be informed. There was a quiet grief that accompanied this decision, not for what I was losing, but for what I had believed I already had. I had thought inclusion was implicit. That trust flowed both ways. That my presence mattered even when my voice wasn't solicited. Letting go of that belief required mourning a version of my family that only existed because I needed it to. But alongside that grief was something steadier. Resolve. I understood that this choice would change how people experienced me. That my absence from certain conversations, certain roles, certain emotional labor, would be felt long before it was understood. I also understood that some relationships survive only as long as one person keeps overfunctioning. When that stops, the relationship doesn't necessarily end, but it reveals its true shape. I didn't fear that revelation anymore. The most important part of this decision was that it wasn't fueled by a desire to prove anything. I didn't need validation. I didn't need acknowledgement. I needed coherence between what I knew and how I lived. Once you reach that point, the decision makes itself. I remember standing in my kitchen that evening, doing something ordinary, washing a cup, drying my hands, feeling an unexpected sense of calm. Not relief, calm. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't explained myself. I hadn't changed anything externally yet. But internally, the line had been crossed. There would be no dramatic moment to mark it, no visible turning point. Just a gradual withdrawal of something I had given too freely for too long. And I knew, without needing to say it aloud, that nothing would ever return to the way it was. Not because I would force it to change, but because I wouldn't carry it anymore. There were no visible shifts, no announcements, no conversations marked a new phase. From the outside, I appeared unchanged, still calm, still present, still reliable in the ways that were appropriate. But internally, everything had been restructured. I began by disentangling myself from informal responsibilities, the kind that had accumulated simply because I never said no. Tasks that weren't assigned but assumed. Emotional labor that had become invisible through repetition. I stopped preempting problems that weren't mine to solve. When something needed doing, I waited to see who noticed. When a decision was required, I asked for information instead of offering solutions. And when that information wasn't provided, I didn't move forward anyway. This alone created a quiet disturbance. I also made practical adjustments. I reviewed documents I had once skimmed. I asked for copies of things I had previously trusted others to summarize. I read policies, timelines, and agreements carefully, not to challenge them, but to understand exactly where I stood. Nothing I did was confrontational. Everything was procedural. I stopped being available by default. I responded on my own timeline. I let calls go to voicemail. I declined meetings without agendas. And when I did participate, I listened more than I spoke. Silence, used this way, isn't empty, it's a mirror. People began to hear themselves more clearly when I stopped cushioning their words. They noticed gaps in their own explanations. They felt the weight of decisions they had grown accustomed to handing off. Still, no one named it. That's the thing about moving in silence. It doesn't trigger alarms. It creates space. And in that space, systems reveal their weaknesses. I was careful not to overcorrect, not to disappear entirely. Withdrawal, when done too quickly, invites pursuit or resistance. I moved slowly, deliberately. just enough to test the structure without destabilizing it all at once. And all the while, I kept my composure. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't trying to be noticed. I was simply aligning my actions with my boundaries. By the time anyone realized something had changed, the changes were already in effect, and I was no longer standing in the same place. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. Missed details, small delays, moments where someone assumed something had been handled, only to realize it hadn't. Not because I refused outright, but because I was no longer intercepting problems before they became visible. Questions began circulating without clear answers. Tasks stalled. Plans required revisiting. The kind of friction that had once been absorbed quietly now surfaced, awkward and unresolved. And still, no one pointed to me. Instead, people looked around, slightly disoriented, as if a familiar piece of furniture had been moved in the dark. They sensed the absence before they understood its source. I noticed how often my name came up in passing. Did Florence know about this? I thought Florence was taking care of it. Each time the assumption revealed itself, I responded neutrally. I wasn't involved in that decision. I didn't have the information needed. I wasn't asked. No accusation, just a fact. Those statements landed harder than any emotional appeal ever could have, because they reframed the situation without dramatizing it. They made the structure visible. People began to realize, slowly, that outcomes they relied on were no longer guaranteed, that the smoothness they had taken for granted had been maintained by someone who was no longer doing that work for free. There was irritation at first, not directed at me exactly, but at the inconvenience. The system was no longer efficient, and inefficiency always demands attention. Still, no one apologized, not yet. Instead, there were attempts to re-establish the old dynamic. Casual check-ins, friendly tones, vague invitations back into the fold. We should catch up. Let's talk soon. I could use your thoughts on something. I listened. I considered. And I declined where it made sense to decline. Not coldly, just clearly. I wasn't interested in resuming a role that came without voice. And I wasn't willing to step back into it under the guise of connection. As the weeks passed, the consequences became harder to ignore. Decisions took longer. Errors went uncorrected. Responsibilities shifted unevenly. And with each small disruption, the unspoken truth edged closer to the surface. The system had relied on my silence far more than anyone had acknowledged. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel guilty. I felt steady. This wasn't a collapse, it was recalibration. And I knew then that the next phase wouldn't be quiet forever. Because once people feel loss, even if they can't name it, they begin to search for its cause. The shift from confusion to panic didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in stages. First irritation, then concern, then a subtle urgency that no one quite knew how to voice. People began to double-check things that had once been assumed. Messages carried a sharper edge. Conversations circled back on themselves. There was more talking, but less clarity. That's when the realizations started to surface. Not consciously, not yet, but instinctively. Something wasn't working the way it used to. I could see it in the way people hesitated before making decisions. In the way responsibility was passed back and forth without landing anywhere. In the way they searched for reassurance that never quite arrived. And slowly, inevitably, attention turned toward me. Not an accusation, an appeal. I was asked questions framed as concern. Are you all right? You seem quieter lately. Is everything okay between us? Each one carried the same unspoken hope, that I would step back into the role that made everything easier. I answered honestly but selectively. I'm fine. I've just been more focused on my own priorities. I'm taking a step back from a few things. Those answers were true. They were also insufficient for them. What they wanted was not an explanation. It was a restoration. Attempts were made to re-engage me through familiarity. Shared memories, jokes, invitations that echoed the past. And when those didn't work, the tone shifted again. This time toward urgency. Mistakes had been made. Oversights acknowledged. Not in specifics, but in generalities. We should have communicated better. Things got away from us. No one meant to exclude you. Still, no one named what had actually happened. By the time anyone was ready to have that conversation, it was already too late. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the foundation had changed. I was no longer standing where they expected me to be, and I wasn't interested in rebuilding a structure that depended on my silence to remain stable. There's a moment in every dynamic where repair is possible only if both sides are still invested in the same version of reality. We weren't. I had moved on. Not emotionally, but structurally. I had built a life that no longer revolved around being the stabilizer. I had redistributed my energy, my attention, my trust, and that kind of change can't be undone with good intentions. The panic reached its peak when people realized that my absence wasn't temporary, that I wasn't waiting to be invited back in, that I wasn't holding a grudge that could be soothed. I wasn't angry. I was finished. Finished explaining. Finished accommodating. Finished absorbing. The hardest part for them wasn't losing my help. It was losing their certainty. The certainty that I would always be there to make things work. By the time they understood that certainty was gone, the moment to fix it had passed. Not because I closed the door, but because I walked through another one. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, no moment where anyone called me out. It arrived quietly, wrapped in concern and framed as a conversation that needed to happen for the sake of everyone. We sat together in a familiar space. The setting alone carried years of unspoken history. I noticed how carefully everyone chose where to sit, how long they waited before speaking. The atmosphere wasn't hostile, it was cautious. Someone began by saying they felt distance. Another mentioned miscommunication. A third spoke about how things used to work better when we were all on the same page. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to reassure them. When it was finally my turn to speak, I kept my voice even. Not defensive, not cold, just clear. I said that I had stepped back from roles I had never agreed to formally. I had realized I was often informed after decisions were made, and expected to adjust without context. Over time, this had shaped a dynamic where my silence was treated as agreement. No accusations, no examples meant to corner anyone, just statements of fact. There was a pause after that, the kind that reveals more than words. I could see recognition flicker across a few faces. Not guilt, exactly. More like recalibration. A sudden awareness that something they had relied on unconsciously was no longer available. Someone tried to explain. Another tried to soften it. "We didn't think you felt that way." "I guess we assumed you were okay with it." I nodded. "That's the point," I said calmly. Assumptions replaced communication. No one argued with that. What struck me most was how little emotion I felt. I wasn't seeking validation. I wasn't hoping for apologies. I had already made peace with what this conversation could and couldn't do. They asked what I wanted going forward. I told them the truth. That I wasn't interested in re-entering the same dynamic under a different label. That transparency mattered to me now. Not as a courtesy, but as a requirement. And that if that wasn't possible, I would continue as I was, quietly, independently. There was no agreement reached that day. No resolution neatly wrapped up. But something important happened anyway. The illusion broke. For the first time, they saw me not as the stabilizer, but as someone who could opt out. Someone who didn't need to escalate to be firm. Someone whose calm wasn't an invitation to proceed without consent. We parted politely, almost gently, and as I walked away, I understood that the confrontation hadn't been about fixing the past. It had been about confirming that I no longer belonged to it. Who I am now is quieter than who I was before, but not smaller. For a long time, my identity was built around being dependable, being reasonable, being the person others could lean on without asking. I wore that identity comfortably, believing it reflected strength and maturity. Now I understand that strength without agency is just endurance. These days, I choose where my energy goes. I no longer confuse proximity with intimacy, or responsibility with belonging. I still care, but I care with boundaries that don't require constant explanation. I'm no longer the person who arrives early to smooth things over. I arrive when invited, when informed, when my presence is part of the process, not just the outcome. What's changed most isn't how others treat me, it's how I respond. I don't rush to fill the silence. I don't preempt discomfort. I allow conversations to unfold without steering them toward ease. Some relationships have softened. Others have grown distant. Neither feels like a failure. I've learned that not every bond is meant to survive clarity. Some depend on one person's staying unaware. Once awareness enters, the relationship must either evolve or end quietly. There is no bitterness in that for me now, just realism. I trust myself in a way I didn't before. Not because I've become harder, but because I've become more precise. I notice when something doesn't align, and I don't override that awareness to keep the peace. I still value calm. I still value restraint. But now they serve me, not the other way around. If someone wants access to my time, my insight, my steadiness, they meet me with transparency. If they can't, I don't argue. I adjust. This version of me doesn't need to be understood by everyone. She needs to be coherent to herself. And that, I've learned, is enough. There's a simple truth at the center of this story, and it took me years to see it clearly. Silence is not neutral. When you are quiet out of fear, it erases you. When you are quiet out of habit, it confines you. But when you are quiet by choice, it becomes a line. For a long time, I believed that love meant understanding without explanation. That loyalty meant adapting without complaint. That maturity meant absorbing discomfort so others didn't have to feel it. I was wrong. Love without honesty is just convenience. Loyalty without voice is just compliance. And maturity without self-respect is just endurance with better manners. No one in my family woke up one day and decided to lie to me maliciously. That's important. The harm didn't come from cruelty. It came from comfort. From people growing used to a version of me that made their lives easier, and then mistaking that ease for consent. Everyone knew, except me. And once I knew, the story changed. Not because I punished anyone. Not because I demanded restitution. But because I stopped participating in a dynamic that required my unawareness to survive. That's the part I want to leave you with. You don't have to confront every truth loudly. You don't have to explain every boundary repeatedly. And you don't have to wait for someone else to acknowledge what you already see. Sometimes the most honest response is adjustment. Sometimes the most powerful closure is alignment. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back, not to be noticed, but to be free. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to know why. Have you ever realized that people around you were operating on an understanding you were never given? And what did you do once you saw it? I'll be reading your thoughts in the comments.